So let's communicate about the climate. I mean, let's climunicate.
I would start by asking you, in the title you have doubt, uncertainty, chaos. I know you worked a lot on this uncertainty and so on, but in the context of climate change, I mean, in quantum physics, this is not a problem because it's not political, but in terms of climate change, how do you feel these terms are interpreted by a number of people? We have a large spectrum of people, from the alarmists to people who think that nothing is happening to the climate.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a really good question and a good topic we can discuss. I think the issue with, say, take climate change. We're talking about climate change. There are two issues, let's say, which I think needs to be clear what we're talking about. So there is the science of climate change, and then there is, if you like, the politics or the actions that we may or may not want to take coming out of the science. And I think it's really, really, really important to distinguish these two things, to know when one is talking about science, because science, after all, should be dispassionate and neutral, disinterested in the sense of not sort of promoting a particular political action. And then there is the politics. What should we do about this? So, I often say, a way of distinguishing the two is to say, well, what are the risks arising from climate change in terms of undesirable things? And as we speak, right, actually at this very precise moment, Florida is getting battered by a very severe hurricane whose intensity was almost certainly exacerbated by the warm sea temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico that were in turn exacerbated by climate change. So we can talk about the risk of extreme events, the storm surges associated with the hurricane, and more generally with undesirable things that are happening around the world in terms of sea level rise and extreme weather and all the rest of it. But then when you go to say, okay, given those risks and given that it's desirable that we should reduce those risks, should we therefore be cutting our emissions of carbon dioxide? And that then becomes a kind of, well, let's call it political, but it's a question that involves value judgments that are kind of outside the scope of, I would say, science, and certainly outside the scope of climate science, because there are all sorts of economic, impacts of implementing, net zero policies. And it's not just in terms of, Europe and North America. It's the global South. It's trying to balance possible impacts on economic development in countries where they're in desperate need of economic development, with these global risks. So in my book, I deliberately kept these two aspects separate. So I've got a chapter on the science of climate change, and a chapter on, well, given these risks, what should we do about it? And the second chapter, I preface things by saying that I'm going to state my own personal view here. And in a sense, it's not, I'm not speaking as a scientist now when I say this is what we should do. I'm speaking just as a, member of the public. And in a sense, I don't think my the value judgments that I bring to bear on this problem are any more, any better, if you like, than anybody else's. Just because I know some climate science doesn't mean to say that my value judgments are better than other people's. I'm just an ordinary person. I'm not an expert on the economics of the global South, for example, or some of these development issues and so on and so forth. So, but I think it's important, and this is where I depart from some of your other guests who've spoken about uncertainty, where I'm quite happy to say up front that for me, as just an ordinary guy, if you like, who lives in England, I think it's a no-brainer. Even though lots of things are uncertain about climate change, and I mentioned about clouds, I still think it's a no-brainer that we should be doing everything we can to cut our emissions. Okay, but I just want to stress, I'm making that statement not because I'm, a super professional climate scientist. It's just obvious to me as a member of the public, as just an ordinary human living on the planet. And I would challenge some of those who also stress uncertainty about climate science to come out and make those sort of statements. I mean, if they're not in favor of mitigating climate change because they think it'll be too expensive or it'll wreck the economy, okay, fine, but come out and say that. Preface your remarks about uncertainty with that statement, because I think it's important to know where you're coming from. The problem with uncertainty is it can be used, and people do use it, as a sort of a smokescreen for trying to do nothing about the problem. Nothing means not putting in any policies towards mitigation. And I personally I'm kind of rigorous. I try to be rigorous about and precise about saying what we know and what we don't know, and quantifying uncertainty where we can. But I'm telling you now up front, this is not a reason to do nothing. Absolutely. It's a reason to actually try to understand things better and put some effort into trying to reduce the uncertainty in the important things that we don't understand. So I make those points in my book, and I really think it's important to stress that. So it's scientifically correct to say extreme weather events are becoming more extreme, more commonplace because of climate change. If we wish to reduce those risks, we must cut our emissions of carbon dioxide. Whether we want to actually reduce those risks and cut emissions of carbon dioxide is a value judgment. I think it's a no-brainer. Other people may not do. Okay, but it's important to be clear where the debate is. The debate is not actually about the science so much as the value judgments.